Thanks so much for watching, listening. Totally stoked that you're here. Here's a great joke. Right. I can't understand why my calculator just stopped working. It doesn't add up. I know, you're like, that's stupid. Of course. So we got the joke over with, and now you need to subscribe. Hello? Why wouldn't you? Because we have great content. And we're continuing our series called Be Strong and Courageous. Love this series because it comes out of the book of Joshua. And Joshua is an interesting book. The first half of it is all kinds of action-packed, and it's really, really cool. The second half is, I'm honest with you, I think it's super boring. You're like, you can't say that. Well, I just did. And the reason I think it's boring is because the second half is about Israel, the various landscapes and places and ways that the tribes of Israel took presence, not how they did it, but their actual land distribution in the promised land. So for the first half, I'm like, woo, let's go. And that's what that's what this series is about, is the first half. And so it's be strong and courageous. And it's about, this whole series is about transition. And I'm bringing it to your attention because Moses, who was the premier liberator for Israel, he's dead. And his successor is Joshua. And God had spoken way back to, Jacob and Joseph, way back in Genesis, that Israel, the nation of Israel, would come back and possess the promised land. They had this kind of like hiatus, if you want to call it that, little pause in Egypt for a couple hundred years, and then they came back. So God had made this promise way back, hundreds of years before. And in order for Israel to fulfill that promise from God, you had to have, in essence, these two men. One was Moses. Moses was the dude that led them out of slavery and captivity. But the second gentleman was Joshua. And Joshua was responsible to lead them into the promised land. Two very different people, and both very essential to God's plans and purposes. And so sometimes when you're in transition, you feel awkward because you're like, well, I don't really belong over there, and I don't really belong over here. I can't see myself over here. And you feel like you're in this like limbo halfway place. So what do you do in that limbo land? You're uncertain. And God tells Joshua, in that limbo uncertainty, I know how to do this, but I can't really see this. He tells Joshua, be strong and courageous. And again, I think that works into our hearts and into our souls. Be strong and courageous. Because the things that God has for us, the promised land, the future, requires us to have a mental heart and emotional state of being, and actively choosing to be strong and courageous, repelling fear and weakness. Because fear and weakness are the opposites of strong and courageous. And so I want you to like this right now because, again, super, super helpful content. And of course, you want to share this with your friends. But I want us to take for a moment and think about Jericho, because we've been talking about kind of this progression as it relates to transition and keeping our hearts strong and courageous with God's help, of course. So we've talked about coming through the Jordan River. And how does that happen? And if you want to read how that happens, you ought to check out Joshua chapters 3 and 4. Super, super interesting. But I want us to pop over to chapter 6, because in chapter 6, this is Jericho. And this is the very first military engagement for the nation of Israel in the promised land. And it's kind of sets up for what it's going to look like for now the next 10, 15 years, plus or minus, for Israel conquering the promised land. But Jericho's a really big, significant, first major military obstacle. So they cross the Jordan River, and now we're faced with, this is what we're going to be doing, and this is what it's going to be like. But when you think about it, military engagements, what God speaks to Joshua in chapter 6 is an unusual strategy. You're like, what do you mean by that? Well, he tells the Israelites, we're going to march around the city of Jericho one time, and we're going to be quiet. all the military dudes, we're going to march around it one time every day for 6 days, which doesn't feel very like militaristic. You know, it's like, what are we doing? We're taking a walk and we're doing like silent walking. How is that military? How is that fighting? What are we doing here? You know, this feels like, might feel stupid, inane, like pointless. What are we doing? And I think it's really important that when God tells us to do something, and I don't think it's wrong or bad to question God. I think it's good. Like, why are we doing this? I don't understand. But I always come back to God's ways are higher than our ways. I don't have to understand. And a lot of times I understand in retrospect, in hindsight. I don't always understand in the middle of something or even anticipating it. And so I want to encourage you that when you're in transition, sometimes God tells you to do things that are like, like it's illogical. It's not military. And finally, after 6 days, they march around the city 7 times, blow trumpets. And it's interesting because literally in the Bible, it says the walls were pushed down. It's not like they fell out, because if they had fallen out, it might have smashed some Israelites. They didn't fall in. It was like they were pushed down. And archaeologists to this day, if you go to the ancient ruins of Jericho, they will tell you, in the excavations, because I love archaeology, they will tell you that those walls, it's a very strange phenomenon. Strange, because God's ways oftentimes are higher than our ways. The walls were literally pushed down into the ground, and Israel walked across and into the city and possessed it. So just encouraging you with all of this today, and comment here. In what ways has God told you to do something that's odd, unanticipated, seems strange, doesn't seem logical, doesn't seem like, how has God done that? And can you look back and see, oh my goodness, man, now I see in hindsight, but on the present of it. So it's important that we're strong and courageous and keep our faith and focus on God. So thanks again for subscribing. Thanks for sharing with your friends. And we'll continue this series next week on Be Strong and Courageous.